Deuteronomy 42:35. Their feet shall slide in due time.
In this verse is threatened the vengeance of God on the wicked, unbelieving Israelites, who were God's visible people, and who lived under the means of grace, but who, notwithstanding all God's wonderful works towards them, remained, as in verse 28, void of counsel, having no understanding in them.
This line opens Calvinist minister Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, delivered in 1741. The sermon is often associated with the sort of elaborate shouting performances that were stereotypical of fire and brimstone style rhetoric. But those who saw Edwards preach claim he did so calmly, with his sermon notes in one hand and his Bible in the other.
The expression which I have chosen for my text, their foot shall slide in due time, seems to imply the following things relating to the punishment and destruction to which these wicked Israelites were exposed. That they were always exposed to destruction. As one that stands or walks in slippery places is always exposed to fall. This is implied in the manner of their destruction coming upon them, being represented by their foot sliding. The same is expressed, Psalm 73:18. Surely thou didst set them in slippery places, thou castest them down into destruction. 2. It implies that they were always exposed to sudden, unexpected destruction. As he that walks in slippery places in every moment liable to fall, he cannot foresee moment whether he shall stand or fall the next. And when he does fall, he falls at once without warning. 3. Another thing implied is that they are liable to fall of themselves, without being thrown down by the hand of another, as that he that stands or walks on slippery ground needs nothing but his own weight to throw him down.
His calm delivery and his habit of breaking down his arguments into numbered sections both make him feel more like a lawyer than a preacher. His intent wasn't to terrify people with vitriol. He saved that task for God.
The observation from the words I now insist upon is this: there is nothing that keeps wicked men at any one moment out of hell than the mere pleasure of God. By the mere pleasure of God, I mean his sovereign pleasure, his arbitrary will, restrained by no obligation, hindered by no manner of difficulty.
This description of God is very Old Testament. The loving God who sacrificed his son to save humanity doesn't seem to keep in touch with Edwards very much. Instead, Edwards knows a God that is cruel, vindictive, and above all else, arbitrary. There isn't any real reason that God would have sinners and keep them around in the world. Edwards' idea of sin is very broad, but it includes a lot of very tangible evil. God could cast all of the murderers and rapists down into hell, but why should he? God is above mere earthly pain and pleasure, and according to Edwards, you will be too.
The world of misery, that lake of burning brimstone, is extended abroad under you. There is the dreadful pit of the glowing flames of the wrath of God. There is hell's wide, gaping mouth opened, and you have nothing to stand upon, nor anything to take hold of. There is nothing between you and hell but the air.
Death surrounded everyone when Edwards gave this sermon. Disease was widely demonstrated, but barely understood. Warfare between colonists and natives resulted in entire villages being burnt down and entire families being torn apart. It's nearly impossible for us now to imagine the amount of misery that would have come with living at that time. If the Earth is proof that there's a God, then the fact that Earth isn't very good must have proven that God himself was not very good. Many contemporary preachers will claim that salvation through Christ can lead to a good life, but a good life wasn't possible for those living in the 18th century. A good afterlife was all they could hope for. Of course, Edwards doesn't focus on that positive half. He doesn't spend a lot of time on heaven, at least not in this sermon, and there's a very real reason that he chooses not to do that. There's a George Carlin quote that I swear is relevant here. Carlin states, "The upper class takes all the money, pays none of the taxes. The middle class pays all the taxes, does all the work. The poor are there just to scare the shit out of the middle class." In a similarly unfair hierarchy, those living in heaven are living infinitely better lives than those living on earth. You might resent the idea of living just to die and go to heaven, but it can't be worth the risk. Maybe the whole idea of heaven and hell is unjust, but if you try to fight it, you will go to hell. So long as you don't stir the pot too much, you can quietly go to heaven while all your unbaptized friends suffer in eternity.
How dreadful is the state of those that are daily and hourly in danger of this great wrath and infinite misery. But this is the dismal case of every soul in this congregation that has not been born again. However moral and strict, sober and religious they otherwise may be.
Edwards refers to the unbaptized as natural men, and it seems strange to hear the word natural being used pejoratively. Now, we tend to think about nature as being good and proof of God's wonder and divinity. But nature has its downsides, even if modern society has managed to shield them from us somewhat. When Edwards thought of nature, he thought of tuberculosis. He thought of huge animals that could tear men apart, and winters that were so cold they could freeze entire towns to death.
The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the dire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sights. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes, as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours.
Edwards was not fond of nature, but why should he have been? Why should God be fond of his creations if they reject him? Edwards presents a version of humanity that is just as terrible and evil as the world around it. He paints a bleak picture here, and not just to make people sad and angry. He does it to show them the horrible path that they've chosen for their lives so far, and to show them that there's an alternative. By accepting Christ, Edwards claims that you can be a part of something greater than the spiders and the dirt. God's offer to humanity, according to Edwards, is truly beautiful, but it's important sometimes to recognize the alternative.
Thus all you that never pass under a great change of heart by the mighty power of the Spirit of God upon your souls. All you that were never born again and made new creatures and raised from the dead in sin to a state of new, and before altogether inexperienced light and life are in the hands of an angry God.
Are you circumcised?
The blood's bright red. That means the consumption hasn't taken hold yet.